So I was thinking that maybe we could start by introducing ourselves, and then maybe along with that, what is it about this book that originally spoke to you? What made you choose this book to read, I guess? And I'm going to give you guys a disclaimer. I have no idea how to approach this book in terms of a discussion because of how complex it is and how many ways one could go into the book. So I'm definitely open to following this discussion wherever it goes. So I guess I will start since I asked that. I'm Sherlanya for anyone who is watching this. And the book we're discussing today, Michael Twitty's The Cooking Gene, is actually a book that I bought when it came out and have been meaning to read for a long time. I had read part of it, but when thinking about a list of books to think about as we consider the America's past and present with racism, this book felt like a really interesting way to think about that question. And so that's why I found myself face to face with this book again after putting it down for a couple years.
Yeah, I guess I can go next. I'm Hannah. So I am fairly into like food culture and restaurants. I would call myself a foodie. And so I listened to a few different like food podcasts, and I saw this title come up a few times. But I hadn't read it until I saw it on like the list for the Black Lives Matter discussion series. And just reading it, I really appreciate the complexity of the text. There's a lot of different themes and history and food culture that he explores. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about it.
I'm Heidi, and I guess I came to this book interested in reading it for this series because I have a background in 19th century and I guess some 20th century American literature and issues of race and slavery in the 18th and 19th century. So I've read kind of a lot of, especially like 19th and kind of classic 20th century works of African American literature. And this was a take that has a very kind of contemporary feel, and also with the way it brings together thinking about history, genealogy, food, and family and sort of local culture was really interesting to me to kind of maybe bridge outside my more like academic perspective and think about just like what's happening in the world right now and how are folks thinking through these complexly intertwined questions.
What's one thing that surprised you in reading this book? This might be a good way to get a conversation going.
Yeah. Well, something that I don't know if surprised is the right verb, but something I really enjoyed in the book that I wasn't expecting him to talk about was not only like the birth of African American and Southern cooking, but it was all the background from those countries in Africa and talking about the dishes that came here from Africa. It was really interesting to me because I feel like in America, or at least in my experience, I hadn't really learned about those dishes. So it was really intriguing to kind of learn about a different culture's food and how it influenced Southern cooking. So that was really cool for me.
Cool. I feel like I'm interviewing you guys. I want this to feel like a conversation instead. I'm like, what can I do to make this feel like it's not, I feel like not like an interview. That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess I don't know, like Yeah, I wouldn't say I actually pulled this cookbook out for this conversation. It's also kind of related to what I was just talking about. I had just checked this cookbook out like last week. I don't know if you guys have heard about it. It's in BB's Kitchen. It's
I
Hawa
have heard
Hassan's
about that.
new cookbook. So I had checked this out, and I'm, reading the Cooking Gene at the same time. And that was really cool for me because, I don't know, it kind of gave a picture to the dishes that he was talking about. So in BB's Kitchen, she interviews like grandmothers from different African sorry, I'm tongue-tied. Diaspora countries, and they like share all these recipes and stuff. So it was kind of cool to like combine these two books for me and see like the photos as well.
It's interesting. One thing this book made me think about, actually the series made me think about, I think, because it had to have been this, because I'm thinking about it now and I wasn't thinking about it before. Basically everything right here is all cookbooks. Like I love cooking. I love reading about food. I listen to food podcasts. I get all the magazines. I love reading about food and thinking about food. And like, if you read enough of that stuff, a lot of times you look at two things and you're like, these guys feel like cousins. And usually if you go and like look at it, they are, sometimes you can see it in the language, sometimes you can see it in the technique, sometimes you can see it in the ingredients. But one thing that I realized is that very little, I just hadn't explored, I just hadn't explored reading about like African-American food or African food at all, really. And part of what made me realize that was thinking about food as a way to explore some of the issues around history and the way that race functions in a contemporary context. I have a lot of books, right? So like in some cases it's like, oh, what can we use that's on this bookshelf? And I was like, you have virtually nothing on your bookshelf. And then I had to like sit with that. But I was also like, that is not surprising either, because like you're coming at food through food media, and you're not coming at it from like from any other point of view, coming at it directly from this food media point of view. And this book, I feel like this was a good book to read in that context, because they're big swaths of things that just hadn't been thinking about food.
There's a section when you were asking about what surprised us about the book, the chapter about comparing like Jewish diaspora and food cultures to African American diaspora and food cultures, and his conversion to Judaism. That was something that kind of stood out and surprised me. But also in that discussion is he says the food is an archive, a keeper of secrets, a way to like think through these questions in a way that he says is not always done with a book. And so when you're saying like you don't necessarily have that many books on your shelves about this, I think that kind of captures it, like his take on the histories and sort of material and food cultures he's thinking through is really something that we don't see a lot of, I feel like, in quite this way. So that was really interesting, and sort of what sparked some of my interest in reading.
Yeah.
I found it interesting to read this book too, like coming at it from like this, I haven't done that much reading, maybe I want to do some more, but then to also like see foods that I recognize as a part of my own like food that was just around. And that felt funny too. It's like, you didn't even bother to read about this thing, and you have collard greens in your garden right now, right? Or like when he was talking about, and this is not like, I'm not like when he was talking about like the ways that you just kind of through experience pick stuff up, or like at the kitchen pick stuff up or learn how to do stuff. And like when I think about what I'm gonna cook next Thursday, like that is totally like I want this experience of cooking this particular thing that my mom always cooked, and I know that she grew up with that, right? And it's like you aren't taking the, you like to read about food, you don't take the time to learn about the thing, and you never would have, you never even would have placed yourself in a food tradition, just because again you're coming through mainstream food media, and just sitting on the outside, it's, I don't know, that's kind of the thing I was thinking about as I was reading this.
Yeah. And I think when you mention, like, I don't know, like you learn about this through food media, I think something that I think about, especially with Southern cooking, I don't know, I feel like so much of Southern cooking is based on like the Africans who were enslaved and brought here, and they really built this cuisine. But that narrative isn't really shared or talked about in mainstream like food cooking. And I would say a lot of contemporary Southerners uh, maybe would not be super receptive to that message necessarily. But I think, part of the power of this book is like giving credit where credit's due. Like for example, I think mac and cheese is something that Thomas Jefferson took credit for, but it was his slave Sally Hemings who actually came up with the recipe. So it's just, I don't know, I think something about this book, I just liked that it gave a narrative and gave credit to these people who have done so much for our country and for our cuisine, especially Southern cuisine.
So one thing that I was thinking about in those parts of the book, probably the parts of the book that you're thinking about, are the ways that like that enslaved people's contributions are often not like overt, right? Because I feel like there are ways that we don't have to like look directly at like what slavery means and what slavery has meant. And I think that one of the ways that we do that is by just obscuring the work, right? And I think that one thing that he does, so like one, I was thinking about like how does the fact that like these food contributions are sometimes not acknowledged or not understood or not known about, how does that compare against the other contributions that are not understood and not known about, right? And I think that he gets at some of that even when he's not deliberate, not when he's not specifically talking about the food as prepared items, but also when he's talking about the labor that went into making the food, right? Because like if you think about slavery in this very abstract, very like education, like basic education doesn't touch on it at all. Like you don't think about some of the things that he really makes you think about. Like when he's like does the thing where he goes to like pick cotton to understand what that was about, there he's communicating that there's like so much like one, the physical expenditure that comes with it, but also like the knowledge that comes with it, right? Because like you can't do that stuff if you don't know how to do it. You can't just like willy-nilly carry that weight if you don't know how to do it, right? Or actually the 1619 project was talking about a farmer whose land was being eroded basically through some unfair practices, but just like the knowledge that he and his family had known about like sugarcane, it's like you have to do that in a very specific way in order for it to be profitable. But then when you think about like the stereotypes that come with thinking about slaves, and then like follow the generations, it's like, well, these people don't know anything. These people, blah, 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 and it's like there's a lot of knowledge that had to be acquired there. And there's a lot of knowledge that was contributed by these folks. And he just made me think about how that crosses topics. And then also like how that's a thread that you can't just pull out, he really was very effective of showing just how interwoven these factors that are tied to just food, right, are.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point, especially when you mentioned like it's themes that aren't really taught in schools, or at least not any school that I attended. It's like the fact that the rice industry, like enslaved persons were the ones teaching the slaveholders how to grow rice. Like that is not anything I ever was taught in a public school in this country. I mean, it's like you learn about slavery, but it's in a different kind of, I guess, framework, intentional or not. So that's a very good point.
Yeah, I think the way that each chapter was framed by a theme, the ones that stood out to me especially were like the different crops or types of ingredient, and the way that it was sort of a cross section of all the different ways that that crop or ingredient kind of cut across labor, cultivation, forms of knowledge you bring to cooking, and ways that it's prepared. The one that I was thinking about particularly was the sugar chapter, and what you were saying, Shirlania, about the labor and the work that goes into just food in general, and how much like sugar shaped the slave trade and the demand for sugar and goods that used it, which Twitty talks about. And there's a really powerful piece by Kara Walker, contemporary artist and sculptor, called The Subtlety, that's like this gigantic sugar sculpture that she did in a Brooklyn sugar factory that was going to be closed down. So I'd really encourage folks to like look that up if you're interested in exploring more about sugar and the history of slavery in the Americas in particular.
One of the things that this book made me think about, and I've said this before in some of these conversations, is that reading so many of these books back to back, that makes me feel like the books are like talking to each other, like talking over my head to each other almost. But one of the things that this book made me think about was the Henrietta Lacks book, right? Because in that book, we learn the story of Henrietta Lacks and her cells that were taken and turned into all of these things that ultimately turned out to be profitable, when later her family didn't even have like access to basic health care. And so when we were thinking about the way that the cotton trade and the slavery around cotton squeezed the way that the labor looked, right? So much that, it's like we have to work these people to death and not give them the time and ability to do the foraging that was happening, and how the nutrition went down, right? And so like you have these people who are like contributing so much in terms of the economy, and then like not even able to ingest enough calories to sustain them. It felt like these ideas felt like they could be peering across each other. Like, you see that? Yep. I see you over there, like they're cousins. To me. I'm gonna pull out my notes. What things I wrote down. Or I guess that while I do that, I'm going to ask you guys, like, what is something in this book that you're dying to discuss more, if anything? Or if you're dying to know about somebody else's take on something in particular?
What were your guys' impressions of the Southern discomfort tour? Shirlania, I know you and I spoke at one of these discussions before we kind of got through the text about it. And I feel like actually the Southern discomfort tour he does is kind of in like the background of the text. Like it wasn't like a huge component of the text. But I'm just curious if you guys had any thoughts on that or what your reactions were.
I mean, one thing that stood out to me was sort of earlier on when he talks about going to visit a particular plantation where a family member or family members had been enslaved, and looking for the kitchen, or wanting in particular to know about where that kitchen was, what it would have felt like to cook in it. And then I think it ended up not even really being there, but they found that like the location. Just felt like this really, he talks at several points about finding particular locations or knowing where an ancestor or family member experienced certain events in their lives. And I think that, to me, it felt like that was a driving force, wanting to kind of feel what the work felt like picking the cotton, and taste what the food tasted like. I think there are multiple goals going into that, but it's I think it's something we can all relate to too, in various ways, wanting to kind of have that physical or visceral connection to our own past.
Very fascinated by it. Like, I can't imagine putting myself in that kind of situation that he did, right? Like, to like physically go and interpret these things, like you're thinking. And he was saying, like, I felt the ancestors' presence. Like, it feels like very visceral and very like, in a way that, like, I'm just fascinated that he could be open to that, because I couldn't personally just imagine being that open to something like that. But then on top of that, I feel like that experience is like heavy, right? And so it's curious to me, like, the compulsion to like need to experience that. And clearly, he was driven to do it and he had his reasons, but also to put yourself in a position where people are going to say wild things to you, because that people are just going to say wild things, and he barely flirted with that, right? When he was saying that, when he was pointing out the ways that his knowledge would get challenged in this environment, in ways that he did not see other people's knowledge challenged, right? Or when he was talking about, like, when he tripped and spilled some water, like, people found that very amusing, right? So like, clearly, he's got to be in like one particular headspace, but also like dealing with other folks who are coming to these places for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. It was really interesting to me that he had his DNA test results like read at like one of the plantations, and I think that connects to like both of your points of like he was trying to like step in the shoes of his ancestors, or like feel like a connection there. Having like the DNA results read in that spot, I think kind of furthered that. Yeah. I don't know. It also stood out to me when he was, I can't remember which plantation, but there was like a Civil War reenactment. It was like 100 guys with like muskets, and he was just in the kitchen, and I don't know. I feel like the mixture of emotions he probably felt in that instance. I don't know. He's very strong to be able to put himself in that spot.
Yeah, I think the discomfort tour, it's a very public form of what I was talking about. Could be a very individual trying to, visit the places or think about what and where your ancestors may have been experiencing things. For him, this was I don't know, it's performative, but it's like it has the like an activist bent in a way. Like he has to come at it with the knowledge that people are going to come at him with all kinds of different interpretations or assumptions or misreadings of what he's doing. And I think that, yeah, I can't quite imagine doing that either, or what it must have been like or be like. But yeah, I think, was it that chapter with the Confederate reenactment where it was they bonded over familiar foods?
It was over it was over the beer. He brought
the beer
with him, and then everyone wanted to be his best friend.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's something interesting too about the way that the food and sort of food and drink traditions also have this bonding force too, potentially, at the same time as they mask or hide potential, like, you know, this whole history that he's uncovering too.
I think that one of the things that and maybe we already said this another way, but like I think that he really illuminates that tension in terms of expectations for Black people, right? Like in a lot of places, Black people are expected to like do the cooking, but never to be the expert, right? But how can these two things be true at the same time, right? Like if you're doing all of that cooking, how can it be true that you don't know anything about it, right? But I feel like sometimes there are ideas that like we're asked to hold in our heads at the same time that don't make sense, but then we refuse to hold thoughts in our head at the same time that absolutely do make sense. And I find myself thinking about that quite a bit, right? And then like I think we do it for all sorts of stuff, right? I think that sometimes we can make assumptions about people who do like X kind of labor and look at it a certain way. But like, can you do that stuff? And if you can't, when you need it done, is your attitude about like that labor the same as it was when everything was fine, right? And what does it mean to acknowledge that we do that? And what does it mean to confront that? And what does it mean to be different about that kind of stuff? Question mark. One thing that I thought was interesting, one thing that I felt like he did that I wasn't expecting or I wasn't thinking about was his part of what he's doing is establishing basically this, in addition to like his own genealogy, a genealogy of Southern food, right? But he also at times compares it against other pasts, right? That like we would easily accept as something with like a long history, right? So like one example is when he was talking about his, I think, grandmother, and he was referring to her going back to where she had come from in the South, that was her Poland, right? Like there are a lot of ways to express that idea, but I think that he is recognizing that his reader is going to immediately understand that reference and like treat it with a certain seriousness and gravity. And I think that when he makes those sorts of comparisons, he's like very successfully saying like, no, really, there's a long history here and it's very complex and it deserves the respect that I know it hasn't gotten up until this point. And I felt like that was a very effective way of doing that. Or like, I feel like at one of the chapters toward the end when he had gone to Europe and he was saying to someone like, well, this is, in America, this is what we think that Irish food is. And the guy was like, your view of what Irish food is crap, right? And then the guy just left it right there and just left it, right? And I felt like that was a very effective comparison to make. What you guys think about his like, not what you think about, that's not the right question. How did you experience when he's like the parts where he is talking about feeling like connections to ancestors?
So initially, to be honest, I'm not very interested into genealogy and like DNA testing. So initially when he started talking about that, I was like, oh, it's like 3 pages of DNA results. I don't know. But as I read more and began to listen to his ancestors' stories, I began to appreciate more what the DNA test results like showed him, or like that they were able to prove stories that had just been passed down. Mm-hmm. So I guess my initial reaction was like, I don't really need to know that you're 23% blah 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 blah. But as he told these stories, I was able to be like, oh, okay, now I see like how this data is powerful to you. So I really appreciated the way he constructed those chapters.
That's interesting that you're not that into genealogy, because it's a lot about genealogy. And it does kind of fascinate me. But I don't, like, I have some knowledge of how it works, but I think this was a great book that delves into the complexities and challenges of genealogy for African Americans in particular. And what that question sparked for me, I guess, thinking about moments when he experiences sort of a connection to ancestors, I was thinking about the discussions of gardening and how he talks about starting his garden at a time when he was like pretty financially strapped and trying to just work with what he had and grow these particular strains of vegetables and other foods, and then ended up kind of stringing around gourds and shells and other things that it turned out were things that probably family members had done in the past, or folks in that area had also done in various ways, and that he felt this connection to the ways of growing and cooking and preparing the foods that felt powerful, I guess. I'm trying to think about like my experience of reading that. I've thought about growing up in Minnesota, like I think about wild rice, I feel like, in some of those ways. Like I've tried to think about how it was prepared and cultivated, and it's not particularly linked to my ancestry, but in terms of locality, it is. So there's something really interesting about this approach. And then the gardens in particular, he says something about like the gardens are like a form of resistance, that these were places that folks who were enslaved were able to grow things to supplement the very poor rations that they were able to get. So there's another layer going into all of that just really stood out to me.
When you mentioned the rations, something that I thought about it when I was reading this book, it came up that like something I had not realized was a thing before. Heidi, maybe you did know because you've read like a lot of literature that covers this area, but like this came up in this book, and then it also came up in incidents in a life of a slave girl. But like thinking about the fact that like people would slaveholders at social occasions would try to pretend like they were feeding their enslaved people more than they were. That fascinates me, right? Like that it's like, okay, you guys all understand what slavery is because you're all perpetrating it, but like you're trying to make people think that these people are healthier than they are, because like what I just have a hard time wrapping my head around the social rules, right, that make that a thing. And like I was shocked to read it in the one book, and so I immediately noticed it when reference was made to it in this book. And even that, but like I knew that like when people were being sold, that they would try to make them look like healthier than they were, and that like that I don't have trouble wrapping my head around, right? Like if you think that a person is something to make money off of, you're going to do the same thing that you would do to anything else. Like if you're going to sell your car, you're going to try to make that car look as good as it can. That I understand. But like, you know, trying to make everybody think that you're feeding these people better than you are is challenging. And then it's further challenging within like some of the you know, progress narrative type ways that we think about history, when we try to absolve people from the reality of slavery sometimes, right? Like sometimes it's like, well, people know better now or whatever. It's some version of that. And it's like, well, if you're trying to make your neighboring, you know, slaveholder think that you're like giving your folks enough to eat, there's the textual evidence that you knew that this was wrong, right? And so those sorts of, it's like a moment that pops up to me when I read that. A 2-minute like discussion of like some one sentence in the book, but it really just
no, it popped out to me too, not specifically about the rations, but the chapter about cotton. There was an excerpt from a plantation mistress where she was like writing one of her friends, and she said, you should come see the cotton in the spring, it's beautiful and it must be light, pleasant work. And it's like, are you know it's not light, pleasant work. Like, why are you writing your friends that it is? So I understand your reaction there. It's just something about, I don't know, trying to look good, or has
it makes me wonder though.
Reaction.
What's that?
It's a visceral reaction of just like, no, just stop.
When I read stuff like that, it always makes me wonder, like, what are you doing that's like that you can't see? You know, it's like, what is your version of, you know, pretending like you're feeding somebody better than you're feeding, you know?
It definitely feels like lies or things you kind of tell yourself to make you feel better about what it is that you're doing, or like less, I don't know, torn about it. But there's also something about like maybe trying to convey prosperity in general for like a plantation. If you're you know, the enslaved people are well fed, or you pretend that they are, I guess maybe there's an impression of prosperity for the plantation. But yeah, that's awful. I don't know.
Think about. Oh, I had a thought that I wanted to ask you guys about, and it fell out of my head. One thing that I appreciate about this book is the way that Twitty, it's his story, right? Like he's talked about like his own, you know, genealogy, and he's talked about his experience going to all these places and learning all of these things. But I also like the way that he has woven in like his Jewish identity, right? Like I like that he's just like, this is who I am, and I'm just putting this in here. I don't feel the need to give you 8,000 footnotes about it, because like you can keep up with the book or you can choose not to. And then I also in his story, this book made me think about the way that one's sexual orientation might be impacted by like him being in the kitchen and the way that he wove that part into his story, which isn't weaving it into the story because it's just a story, but like I wouldn't have thought about like what the kitchen as a safe place that got like destroyed when his mom is like, you know, you lost your best friend, and then returning to that site, you know, that like the you know, there are a number of sites that he returned to that were associated with painful things aside from like the sites associated with slavery, and those are also a part of his story, right? Like I felt like when he did that, it sort of communicates that like all of the things that we are weave into our story, right? I don't know. I just thought that that was it. I found myself thinking about that in the book, you know, because he could have left that story out, but he didn't. Like the one in particular with his mom and that whole thing. But I was like, did he put that in there to talk about like to make sure that we're thinking about other ways that our society can harm us, and then like we move forward from that? Question mark. So when he was going through all of his genealogy, I found it like so hard to like keep in my mind. And part of it probably had to do with the like maybe if I were reading this book slow, like it, you know, not trying to get it done by a certain date, it would have been perhaps easier to keep that in my head. But I found it extremely difficult to like follow the threads. But one of the things that I found myself thinking about as he was like tracing his story and the people that he was like descended from, is just like deciding how, like what it looked like when he was deciding what those different people or figures maybe meant to him, right? So like he tries to trace his African ancestors, but then he also traces his white ancestors, and then he's like trying to reconcile how to feel about them. And I thought that that was interesting. And I think that every individual probably would interpret those things differently, but I thought that that was interesting to think about, right? Because I feel like he was focused very much on the experiences of the enslaved people. Like what did their day look like? What were the things that they had to do? What, like I felt like the questions that he asked were different, which is fine. You have you ask the questions that you have, but I thought that that was interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was related to that point when he visited the Bellamy plantation, didn't he? And I thought it was really impactful, the scene where he's describing, you know, looking at I forgot his first name, but the Bellamy man who he is related to, he was like looking at his grave and he was thinking, should I like honor it? Should I put like I think he said like a rock was like the Jewish way to honor a grave. And he was like, I don't feel connection to this grave. I'm not going to do that. And I thought that was just a really impactful scene. And I also totally feel you on having trouble tracing or following the genealogy. And I also agree, if I was reading it a little bit slower, I probably would have a better success at that. And I completely forgot until you mentioned it that there's a chart at the beginning of the book that has all of it. And I feel like having that out would have really helped in those chapters. But yeah.
Yeah, when I looked at that chart, I was like, how did he even do that?
Yeah.
You know, like he got, I mean, like from my point of view, I was like, man, he got far.
It's impressive. Yeah.
It's interesting to think about. I tried to do some, like tried to do some genealogy and got farther than I ever thought that I would. But like now, like one thing that I find myself thinking about when I think about genealogy is like my younger son. It's like on one side, like if he does his on one side, it's just gonna like chop off. And then on the other side, it's like, well, and you like his dad's family, like when they talk about like the people they're related to, it's just like I can't even imagine
Mm-hmm.
knowing one's genealogy going back like generations like that. And then they can like rattle it off. Like I can't even imagine what it feels like to be like, I don't even like, I can't even, I so don't have drawers for that kind of information that like when we did the filled out our census thing, I was like, well, what's your, where are your people from? And he's like, this place, this place, this place, this place. And that just fell out of my head because I don't even have storage capacity for that kind of information because it personally has been so irrelevant, right? It's like, I don't know. I just think about that more now, or like I think about like what does it mean to pass on certain traditions. And I just didn't think about it as much with my first son who has two Black parents. Even though like Alex's dad is not African American, um, and so that's its own thing. But like with that, I felt like that part's not my responsibility, right? But like having a kid who's got one Black parent and one white parent, I'm like, I don't want you to like not like in a society where like white sort of the default, I don't want you to like not
Mm-hmm.
pick up any of the like connections or knowledge that comes with my side.
Yeah.
But then I'm like, you didn't think about this with your other kid. Like I am just so confused right now. I'm just like, oh, what does this mean that you're thinking about this totally differently, right? And this book just made me feel like, oh, I have to think about it some more. Have you guys done your own genealogy? Are you interested personally in your own ancestral experiences like that? Hannah was like, nope.
Yeah, my older sister is really into it. So if we're around her, she'll talk about it. Something interesting that she found out, um, which actually like it kind of reminded me of some of the stuff he talks about in this book of like feeling like once you realize your genealogy, you like understand like, oh, this is why I feel an affinity to this culture or this place. So we like my family, so we're from Kentucky. Like the last like maybe 10 years, we've taken vacations in Tennessee and Anderson County. They just have like a really beautiful lake system that we go to. And my parents like have always felt like a really big affinity to that region. And we found out through my sister who's like taking, like doing a lot of genealogy that the first Demarcus in the country was a Frenchman named Demarquis, and he had like a small farm in Anderson County, Tennessee. And so that was kind of like, oh, wait, like we are associated with this county that we thought we weren't associated with. So that was kind of cool.
I have not personally dug into my family's genealogy that much, but I do remember doing a school project in, I think, 9th or 10th grade, maybe, that asked us to go and ask grandparents or older living relatives about family history. And that was a really interesting project. And Twitty mentions how many schools attempt to include a project like that, which is I think can be a really powerful thing, but also in the ways he describes, people have a widely varying range of access to that kind of information about your own family's ancestry. It can, range across the board, including being adopted and, not knowing one's birth parents. And so what that also makes me think about is how he connected the themes he's talking about sort of later in the book to, he's talking about like health disparities and the way that learning to kind of go back to some of these core staple foods can actually really impact nutrition and health in the present moment too. And that's part of kind of the community garden movement he's talking about. So like this genealogy thing also kind of is tied to health and knowing about like your potential kind of health risks and other things too. So the way he's talking about that with like food and diet and how certain staples are just kind of more like compatible with one's like gut bacteria potentially. And I don't know exactly how that works, but I do think that's kind of true. So that was something that those sections made me think about too.
One of the things that I was thinking about in that section of the book, right, when he was talking about also like how certain foods got associated with like slavery and then like had shame associated with it because of the connection. And it just really made me think again of like, what does it mean when the story of your people's contributions are just like erased from the narrative all over the place, right? Like how does it look different for young Black people if their education included the contributions outside of like Black History Month, right? Like outside of like the special character that gets spoken about, a character I say because of the way that like we read about the same people all the time, or like only read about like the exceptional people, but like when your contributions just don't exist, what other inheritances that are like healthy to have just don't exist, right? Or like he talked about it a little bit when he was saying, there's not like a romantic story about the contributions of Black people, right? Like a lot of people have like the romantic story of like a homeland, or a romantic story of like, contributions or achievements of their forebears, I guess. And what would it mean to reclaim that across the board? ? Who knows what the answer to that is, but like that's what his work makes me think about.
Yeah.
What else are you guys thinking about this book? As we round the corner, as we like flirt with the hour mark, what should we make sure to talk about? Okay, I'll ask my favorite question instead. What did this book make you want to learn more about?
I feel like I kind of just want to reread this book because I feel like I read it fairly quickly. And I think there's so much here that I could learn more about. And I think I just want to take the like proper time to kind of appreciate all the work he's put in to creating such a complex book. But yeah, I'm definitely interested in like some of the like the stories of like how rice was introduced to this country, or the sorghum kind of stood out to me, foraging stood out to me, like all these things I just kind of want to reread again and then kind of do more exploration into.
Yeah. I mean, it a little bit gave me the like DNA genealogy bug that I want to try to get into that, maybe not fully, but learn a little bit more about like my family history. I think part of the point, at least that I was getting reading through, is that there's a tendency, I feel like, in this country to kind of, you know, talk about just like white or African American, and he gets into so much more detail in terms of ancestry, from origins in Ghana, or talking about Yoruba culture, to being interested in tracking down what was that Finnish or Scandinavian part of his ancestry in the DNA results. And so like, I think in some ways could be an interesting challenge for folks to be more attentive to like, well, when you say you're white, what do you mean by that? Like what is your ancestry? Because other folks get asked that all the time. Where are you from? Right? Like, where are you really from? And so that's, you know, kind of a rude question, but also be prepared to answer it yourself if someone asks you. So I think that's something I was kind of interested in learning more about, potentially because of the book.
I find myself interested in the food itself. Surprise, surprise. But like, I'm very interested in like in these things that are kind of cousins to each other, right? So like when you know, there was the red drink, right, that he was talking about, the Jamaica, and I'm interested in like, I think it would be interesting to like think about like what this drink looks like contemporarily in other places, like geographically, and then like how does it, what is it like to like maybe have some red pop next to some red Kool-Aid, next to some Jamaica, next to like a strawberry punch, next to like these things that you know came from the same tradition, and just kind of think about that. Or like some of the like the rices that are related, right? Like the jollof rice versus the Spanish rice versus the Creole rice. Like what would it be like to just sort of explore them back to back to back? Question mark. Or even like I stopped while I was reading this book and I was like, I want to look into that Carolina rice, but then like when I was like, I don't have time to do this right now, because I can immediately tell that like there's that, I can look at it and I know that that is like enriched rice that is meant to like capitalize on this brand. That's not the rice that we're talking about here, right? And so it was like I gotta be at a place where I can kind of peel the layers back, because like if one is to do that experimentation, I think it would be interesting to see like what some of the differences are. I mean, I was thinking about like rice anyway, just because there's so many different ways to approach it, and I'm again interested in that. Or like porridge, I'm interested in, right? Because like who calls, is oatmeal porridge? Are grits a porridge? Is polenta a porridge? Like what's the difference between like cream of rice versus like a kanji versus a, like I'm just interested in like where these different ideas are related and how they look in different contexts, right? So maybe this book just gave me another excuse to continue to be interested in what I was already interested in.
Yeah.
Books tend to do, right?
Do you listen to the podcast Spilled Milk at all?
I have listened to many episodes.
You just like reminded me of.
Yep. Cool. Any closing thoughts? What are you reading next, I guess, is my final question. And it doesn't not have to be related to this. I just love hearing about what people are putting into their brains.
So I want to try to reread this. Like I said, I'm also reading this cookbook right now in BB's Kitchen that I'm enjoying. I'm not sure if I'm going to cook anything from it or kind of just read about the recipes. But yeah, just learning more about food and food history.
One of the books I'm thinking of reading next is Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. He just did like a, I don't know, it was like a, he was invited by like Ross School of Business or something. He talked to like different students, asked him questions, and that was kind of interesting. And then I was wanting to like read more. So yeah, that's maybe next up.
Very cool. All right. Well, thanks to both of you for engaging in this conversation. This book was so dense. It was kind of hard to like find a spot to like go in, but we did it. We went in. And I thank you both for having the conversation.
Yeah. Thanks.
Well, thank you too.
All right. Yeah. All right. I'm going to initiate the wave and I'll see you guys later.
Okay.